Our most deprived borough in England over the last 16 years has lost £250 million and a third of its staff, and yet the Fair Funding Review has still left it worse off. I'm Rachel, I'm a public and social policy consultant, and I'm on a mission to scrap council tax, and I really want to talk about the Fair Funding Review. So the aim of the Fair Funding Review was to redistribute central government grants to local government based on relative needs, cost of delivering services, as well as the resources that local authorities have to be able to do this. Up until this year, it's been based on some pretty outdated formula, and I think everybody in the sector agrees that that needed to change. And one of the biggest changes is the updated indices of deprivation that was released in 2025. This change concerns the way in which the funding formula has treated housing costs, and I know I'm getting a little technical here, but try and stay with me. I perhaps need to realise this stuff's not quite as interesting to other people. Fuck it, local government funding's a riot. Anyway, we've decided to assess relative needs and deprivation based on treatment of housing costs. Now, when you're looking at housing costs, you can either look at how much money a typical household has before they have to pay their rent or their mortgage, so their housing costs, or after they've paid their rent and their mortgage, so after housing costs. And whether you're looking at before or after housing costs really matters. Because in areas where housing costs are low, it can artificially make very deprived households look like they've got more disposable income. Whereas the reality can be that their needs are much higher. The levels of deprivation that places like this have been accommodating and fighting for decades aren't necessarily taken into account, nor are things like the health deprivation that creates. Now, in areas with high housing costs, the opposite happens, and households with relatively high incomes can look a lot worse off because they're spending so much of their money on housing. Now, I'm not saying that's right, I'm not saying it's wrong, it's just the way it is. This is the way that we've been calculating it. But when it comes to local government funding, this funding formula has been influenced heavily by how much housing costs in that area. And areas with very low housing costs have seen their funding formulas change, making them look artificially less deprived than they are. It won't surprise you to hear that this is parts of most of the North and the Midlands and some deprived towns, where because of a lack of opportunity, a lack of public infrastructure, a lack of investment for decades, has meant that there's very little opportunity, which depresses housing costs. But treating housing costs this way has pulled funding away from areas with lower housing costs and siphoned it towards areas with higher housing costs. Now, you may think that's fair. People with higher housing costs have got to spend more on the very basics of survival with housing. I can see where you're coming from. But let's go back to our most deprived council, which is Blackpool in Lancashire. The Fair Funding Review has allocated Blackpool Council £5.4 million in absolute terms, more than it did the year before. So its core spending power increases by £5.4 million. To put that in some context, it's about 2%, and it is a below inflation increase, meaning that the council and its services are materially worse off, because Blackpool Council, despite being our most deprived borough, and despite the government having initiated and planned and done a fair funding review, they still have to find £16 million in savings this year in order to balance the books. In the grand scheme of things, particularly in local government, £16 million isn't actually a lot of money, but Blackpool over the last 16 years has had £250 million taken out of its services. That's £250 million from our most deprived borough. Over the same period, Blackpool Council has seen its staff reduced by a third. And because Blackpool's a unitary authority, it has responsibility for social care. And because of the high levels of deprivation in Blackpool, the Blackpool Council spends 75% of its budget on social care. Now, as sure as fossil fuels cause climate change, poverty causes ill health and increases the need for social care. So how are Blackpool responding to this? Well, they do say in their budget proposals that no staff cuts are going to happen and that they're looking at really quite creative ways of getting around this. And one of the ways that they're going to do this is by raising council tax by the maximum, which is 4.99% this year. But going back to the low housing costs, even that increase won't quite touch the sides, because the increase in council tax won't even cover a quarter of what they need to find. Raising council tax will give them an extra £4 million. They need to find 16. The Fair Funding Review has let the people of Blackpool down. And I really don't see how we can achieve anything when we're still asking for tens of millions of pounds of cuts from our most deprived areas. How on earth are we supposed to deliver just services that keep the lid on things at the moment. I mean, forget the lid. The lid's gone. The lid has been blown a long time ago. Now, because of the way council tax works, the council tax paid in Blackpool currently stays in Blackpool, and it funds services that the people of Blackpool need desperately. And because of the way that we fund local government, this means that areas where they've got high needs and low tax bases, so not enough money coming in, there's a cycle of deprivation. Now, sadly, someone's always going to be at the bottom. And at the moment, it's Blackpool. And I don't mean at the moment as in this year. I mean, let's take a much longer term view when Blackpool was thriving and the northwest of England was the industrial hub of the world. But at the moment, these communities are suffering. And the way in which we fund the support for that suffering has got to change. Council tax has got to go. The way in which it stays in poorer communities, and we ask poorer communities to pay for services where they've got higher needs, like just the maths, come on. It's just so unfair. Fair funding review. I really don't know how anyone's ever going to shift the dial with the current funding formulas that we have, even the new ones, the supposedly fair ones, which are blatantly anything but fair, when the people at the bottom are still worse off. Council tax has got to go because fuck me, do we need better policy?